see. We're going live.
All right.
Facebook, be nice to us. This is episode number 62. I had Josh McDowell, Ray Comfort, and
Wow.
Steve Arterburn. Yeah, I had a lot of good people on this show.
Wow. You've had some great folks on your
Yeah,
program.
yeah. So, hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of Laughter for All podcast. I am comedian Nazareth, and thank you for joining us. Remember, you can, as you watch this, you can ask questions, and if we remember to look at the comments, we will respond to them. Honestly and truly, this, as you know, Laughter for All is about laughing. But since the pandemic has started, we've been inviting speakers and different people and physicians and all other people to help you cope with the pandemic. But today we have a comedian. He's a comedian. He's an actor. He's an author, and he's a pastor of a church. So we have a lot to talk about. But he's my good friend. In 1993, he walked into my office 3 years after about a year after I left the clubs and Hollywood and started doing comedy in churches and other Christian venues. And he said, "Hey, can you make money at this?" I said, "Yes, and you can too. I'll help you if you can get me into prisons." And that's when the bank robbery happened, and we both were into a couple hundred prisons with Chuck Colson, and we did
Yeah.
comedy. Thor Ramsey, welcome to the show. Thank you for being with us, man.
It's good to be here. I'm glad to hear that the program, because when you first started talking, you said, this is law. And I'm like, what's the program is law? And
because I have two shows. I have a show every night called Live with Naz. And this is a weekly podcast called Laughter for All. So I have to remember. I have to remember which show I'm doing. But yeah, speaking of that, it's every weeknight at 8:30 p.m. on Facebook on this page, Comedian Nazar's page. But Thor,
you do a program every night.
Every weeknight at this is tonight will be show 175. It's an hour every night. And when I started in March, right after the pandemic, I used to do my jokes, and after 5 shows, my comedy was gone. So I turned it around, and the people become the comedians. So I would ask question, "Hey, give me the worst name for a plumbing business," and they come up with like Farrah Fawcett, or the number 1 and the number 2 business. And then I go, "Give me a worse name for a dry cleaner." And they go,
"These are just through the comments."
I'm live, and they're commenting, and I'm reading their comments.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You're okay, live, and wow. And you can fill an hour that way. Wow, that's pretty impressive, man.
And it started a community of people that, a lot of, some of them are just, lonely. Some of them are going through cancer. Some of them are depressed. And it's their healing of the day. So they look forward. They wait for it to happen.
Yeah,
so
I literally, should I keep this here? I've never used this mic before, but there we go. It looks official anyway. If it doesn't work,
you look official. This looks like Star Wars. Star Wars mic.
There you go. Yeah.
Your joke about I've been married to my wife for 26 years. We've known each other for 2. That killed me. 3 now.
27 now.
27. Wow.
Yeah.
And also your whole bit about the dogs. I mean, if you have tough skin now, I don't know if you can do that bit anymore, shooting a dog.
In today's call, I haven't done it since, how long is this pandemic going? Since last March?
Yeah. Have you been performing since March?
I just performed live for the first time last weekend. I did the Dry Bar Comedy show.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah. So it was a pandemic taping. So in a bunker, we're all wearing helmets and masks. It just, doesn't really lend itself to. No, but actually
they do that in Provo all the time. Yeah, it's not about the pandemic.
Provo, everything's in a bunker. But no, they had them spread out. It was probably only about 50 people the first show, but they were a good 50 people. So that was a fun show. And then the second taping was a small crowd. Let's put it that. It was about 12 or 15 people. So, but the magic, I learned the magic of television. I'll share this story with you, because I shared this story with a few of the comics that night, saying one of the greatest lessons I learned about the magic of television, and I say that kind of ironically, but there's a truth to the magic of television is I was still emceeing at the time, and I happened to be working the Cleveland Improv, and Bud Friedman, who used to host Evening at the Improv because he owned the original Improv. And then I think he owned, a bunch of them throughout the country. But this one was owned by a guy in Cleveland. Bud was coming in for the wedding. And when he was in town, he liked to open the show. So he opened the show, saw my set. He said, after my set, he said, let's get you on Evening at the Improv. A month later, I was doing Evening at the Improv. Now, they used to tape Evening at the Improv this way. They would film 2 shows. So it's 5 comedians a show, 2 shows with the same audience.
Same audience.
There's the key.
Bad.
So we were the first show. So our 5 were the first. They were fresh. They were excited. It was live television taping. It was, for a lot of those people, they were probably tourists, and this was a really cool thing. And so they were a great crowd for us. So I stuck around for the second taping. Well, half the crowd left. Mm-hmm. And they just started taping right away. They didn't wait for anybody else to come in. So they just started taping. And it was 50% of the crowd was gone, literally. And I can't remember this comedian's name, but I'd worked with this guy before. And I could just, as a comedian, well, I would assume we'd all have these feelings, but we all know what it's like to be performing and dying.
Yeah.
And that sinking feeling you have inside. And I could just feel what he was feeling because I could just see it in his face. This is not going the way I want it to go. And after the show, he was talking to me and he was like, when did you get this show? I'm like, I got it about a month ago. And he's like, I've been lobbying 2 years for this show. And I could just tell it was so depressed. Well, I happened to see when they aired on a national television or cable or what, cable's national television too. So, but when they aired on cable, so I saw our program, and then later I was in a hotel room somewhere. I just remember flipping through the channels and Evening at the Improv. I'm like, oh, it's his set. So here he is performing. And if you would have put those shows side by side, they didn't sweeten. It's called sweetening when you add to the laugh track. They didn't sweeten ours at all because we had a good hot crowd. So they didn't need to do anything. The show that he performed for, it actually on television looked like a better set. If you'd have put them side by side,
he should have waited and bought
live. I'm serious. Live, his show was. It's not that there wasn't any laughter, but just not the laughter you want for a live taping. And so that was the lesson I learned. Is like if you're performing on television, you just act like you're killing, and they will fix it. And there's this we had this in the movie, fix it in post. That's kind of a funny saying. Well, not a funny saying, but it's just kind of a motto to go on. It's like, just move on. We'll fix it later. And some things you can fix later. And laughter is certainly one of them.
So the message is, if when you guys watch Dry Bar and you see Thor Ramsey, it is sweetened. Okay, here's the question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Here's the question I wanted to ask you for the longest time. Mm-hmm. Okay, you're a full-time comedian. You're hilarious. You left the clubs, became as a Christian, moved to the. You were doing great. Your career was doing great. You're busy. You've done, Thou Shalt Laugh. You've done Bananas. You hosted Bananas. You've been doing great. And then all of a sudden you go and become a pastor. I mean, I'm an ordained pastor, but I'm not actually changed your career. And you still kept the comedy, but I mean, not as much. Why?
Well, some of it's just, it's being a pastor is a calling. And I don't know who said this, but somebody wise, they said, if you're not doing what God's called you to do, you'll hit a ceiling in your life and you won't be able to go beyond that ceiling. And I really felt like, that was part of it, but I started noticing internally. So long story short, I was part of a church plant in Redlands, California. If your listeners don't know what that means, it's a brand new church start. So you're starting a new church. They call it church planting. So I was part of a church plant. I moved actually to Redlands to help plant this church. Was myself, Forrest Short, and his wife, Heather, who's still the pastor of the church there in Redlands called Emmaus Church. They're doing great now. But so this was probably, we keep saying it's a decade ago, 10 years ago, but it's probably about more closer to 13 years ago.
I remember that. Yeah.
So I moved to Redlands to plant that church with them. And the first year we met in our home in the evenings on Sundays. So I could still travel on Friday nights and Saturday nights and fly home Sunday mornings and then not miss anything. So I was there all the time. And then when we launched publicly, with doing comedy full time, I wasn't there as often, but he let me, I was one of the main, so it was like 3 couples. We moved there to plant this church. There were 3 couples. So I was one of the primary elders at the time, and he would let me preach every now and then. And I remember after the first time, he goes, "How's that feel?" I'm like, "I'm just burning to do it again." And what I started noticing is that just in terms of the internal drive and fulfillment, preaching was the thing that brought that fire in me. Whereas comedy, not that comedy's not fun and everything, but it just didn't have that drive for me anymore. It just wasn't as fulfilling, to be honest. It was a ceiling. I hit a ceiling with it emotionally. And I really believe that was the Lord's hand. You're saying that this is really what I want you to do. And there were times, and I've told people before this, I've said this from the pulpit many times, pulpit meaning just a round table that you stand behind, but these days, but I've said that my sweet spot in life is that 45 to 50 minutes of preaching. I'm going, if that's my happy place, that's the place that everything falls away. And that's the place. If I could just continually do that, I'd be really a happy person. But
without comedy, like if you can just preach every week and not do comedy, you'll be happy.
But I'm coming back to this year, the pandemic's really brought some things out. So I can tell you about some different things I'm working on.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I'll give you for an example. I've never been a political comedian ever. Like I never did any. You and I are both the same. I'm kind of a suburban comic. I do observational stand-up. We're kind of in the same mold. You have a lot to talk about in terms of your background and your ethnicity and everything like that. So I was just from the same standpoint, being married, kids, blah, blah, blah.
Nebraska.
That was my act growing up. Here's how my mom was, here's how my dad was, here's what my town was like, right. That kind of thing. Neighbors had dogs, they barked, that kind of thing. My dad would shoot them. True story. But anyway, and then of course I would always say, I'm not condoning that. I'm just saying they stopped barking, but it was a true story. But the point is, I was never political. And even as a Christian, I never put, and even now it's like, I don't put all stock in the political process, but I really feel like since 2015, the scope of this country has changed dramatically. And the moral landscape of this country has changed dramatically. And I feel like, to be honest, I don't know if this will offend your viewers or not. I didn't vote for Trump in 2016. It was my conscience issue, and it was a character thing. And of course, I didn't vote for Hillary. I couldn't vote for Trump, so I didn't vote. But
you and a lot of Christians, a lot of Christians.
Yeah. I will tell you this: after seeing what he did in office, and some of it was just the reaction to who he was, and I feel like all of us that are, evangelical Christians always sensed that underneath the mainstream media, if you pulled the curtain aside, they were all standing on the left, no matter how far left, but they were all on the left.
Right.
Well, I feel like when Trump came into office, the curtain was removed and we saw they were all on the left, and they didn't even care anymore. Like, yeah, we're on the left and we're going to be on the left and we're going to be propagandists for the left. And just just looking some of the stuff that this is just factual stuff. This is just so incredibly outrageous to me that there was literally from the highest offices in the FBI, literally a coup to try to get Trump out of there. I'm going, and the reaction to him made me, put it this way: the left created me now. So just and how, in terms of authoritarianism. And they're afraid of supposedly the religious right, which, that phrase doesn't even really exist anymore. But they're afraid of religious people and their view of authoritarianism because we believe there's a God who gives his laws, and they're afraid of that authority. The authoritarianism I'm afraid of is authoritarian of humanity, of other human beings. I'm afraid of the left's authoritarianism. So anyway, I'm launching it today is the goal, So I was just working on the final edit, but I'm launching a 5-minute program, 5 or 10 minutes once a week, because that's what I have time called The Protest Show.
And it's Protest Show. Okay. Where can we watch it?
And I'm just going to put it out there on social media. And I'm putting it out on YouTube and Facebook and then every other alternative platform, because honestly, to be honest, I'm not sure how long it'll stay up, because
before they block it.
Something that's even if they're jokes, and I'm literally trying to make it funny, but at the same time, I'm trying to make points. And so I'm doing political humor 5 minutes a week. I've been writing stuff. And Ron McGee, you know, Ron.
Yes, of course.
So Ron and I, a while back, this is probably about a year before the pandemic, Brad Stein had called me, and Brad and I were talking, and so basically, long story short, Ron McGee and I were basically in conjunction with Brad writing a program that Brad was doing called Brad Stein Has Issues.
Yes, I watched that. Yeah. I've had him on the program.
So Ron and I were basically I was like the head writer of that program, and then Ron was, you know, Ron and I'd format the program, and then Ron's great at just, here's an idea, and Ron is great at he's just Mr. Punchline. He's amazing at really brainstorming, and he's just such a valuable writing partner. And so Brad, Ron and I would work out this program. There were guys in San Diego that have a production company, and they were doing it. Initially, the show, I titled the show with Issues, which I really like. But Brad, you know,
had the issue. Yeah.
Well, Brad had, but it was funny.
He will have an issue with you naming this show.
Brad Stein Has Issues. Still a funny concept. And I thought it was a pretty funny show, but long story short, it was just, we didn't know Zoom existed back then, which would have made our lives easier, because part of it was I was driving 90 minutes a week in to meet with Ron, and we'd sit down and format as many shows as we could. And then we'd meet up, you know, the goal was to tape several shows. I think we taped about 3 or 4 at one shot, and we were trying to do a season of about 12, but and it was not a paying gig at this time. So we ran into some issues. As the travel was an issue, the time was an issue, and then we ran into some editing issues in terms of, you know, I really needed to edit the program, and I just didn't have time to do that, because you know what it is, like a comedian. It's like if the editor doesn't have that sense of comedic timing and know what doesn't the funny is, and it wasn't really in front of a live audience other than the crew, and they would laugh at certain moments, but they weren't really, you know, an audience, so to speak. So it was hard to edit if you didn't understand where the funny, you know, was in the thing. So anyway, long story short, we didn't finish that out, but you know, I talked to Ron this last week, and we had brainstormed on Sunday, and then because I had written a bunch of stuff, and I went over it with Ron, and then we punched it up, and then I filmed it Sunday, and then I'm editing it and hopefully launching it today. But the goal is Ron and I will meet once. So we meet on Zoom now, which is great. So I've reconnected with a bunch of, even though this pandemic has been emotionally tough, we'll talk about that maybe, but yeah. So for the last 2 or 3 months, so I've got several comedy buddies other than you that I've been friends with for years. Leland Clausen. Oh yeah. Canadian comedian that people might be familiar with. Funny. Bone Hampton, black comedian. And then Darren Strebolo, who lives up in Cloquet, Minnesota.
He was on the program. Yes.
Yeah. Darren has a radio show too.
Yes.
Well, it's not a radio, but he has a radio show that he does. I don't know if it's a podcast, but he does a radio show. But I've been friends with those guys for years, and Leland and I have stayed in the most contact. But again, when you're not doing comedy full time and your career takes a different trajectory like mine did in terms of, you know, ministry, and pastors are different than comedians. It's really odd, you know, because I thought, you know, because with comedians, and you've probably sensed this, like, so there's something about being a club comic where you'll fly to a city, you work with 2 other comics for the week. Generally, you stay in the same, they call it a condo, which is just an apartment that's has 3 bedrooms basically. So you share living quarters with these other comedians, and then you eat together all the time and go out to eat, and you end up, you know, getting to know each other. You're vacationing with each other for a week basically, but you understand the trenches of comedy too. It's kind of like, until you do stand-up comedy in front of a live, hungry crowd, either hungry for laughter or hungry for your blood, one of the two, only comics really understand that particular war, let's say it that way. So you kind of develop this band of brothers and sisters. So you can work with a comic for a week or two, and then you don't see him for 5 or 10 years, and you run into him, you kind of pick up where you left off.
Exactly.
And you just have this kind of bond. And I was thinking, well, pastors, we're bonded by the Spirit. We'll clearly have a greater bond than, no, it's not that way. And because I found that comedians have a certain there's a certain psyche and personality that these type of people become comedians. But because humanity is so varied, pastors are really varied in terms of their personalities. It's like, okay, we're all preaching the same word, yes, but man, pastors, they can be really different. And sometimes they can, it's like it becomes territorial sometimes. But I finally found in the last 2 years or 3 years, I found a group of guys in the area, and we get together, other pastors, we get together once a month, and it's just, and you really feel this sense of camaraderie. And none of us have big churches. I think that's part of it. Most of us are church planters, or we have smaller churches. And so there's more of a sense of camaraderie, because I would say church planters come closer to the mentality of comedians than.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but could this be comedians come from an insecurity place, where pastors, especially when they have bigger churches, they come from an ego play? Like there is a.
Well, I don't see. I've never really bought into the fact that all comedians are working from a place of insecurity, because if you listen to.
You weren't, yeah.
Well, Mel Brooks, I always thought this was interesting. Mel Brooks used to. I don't know where I heard him say this, but I heard him interviewed once, or I read this in an interview. He said that. Man, he felt so loved growing up. Like his parents just showered him with love. Mm-hmm. And so he was, secure. But he said the only place he could really replicate that love was on stage. So it was really that, really, really coming from a functional home that made him. And I think a lot of comedians develop comedy as a defense mechanism to getting beat up or being picked on. And generally, oppressed groups become good at comedy. If you look at the history of the Jewish people, famous Jewish comedians, because the Jewish people have always been a minority, they've always been oppressed, Black comedians. But if you look at oppressed groups, and I'm not jumping on the social justice bandwagon the way culture defines biblical social justice defines justice, not the way the BLM social justice.
BLM
completely
justice.
Different type of mindsets. Political social justice and social politics, those arguments always fail. But let's not mistake it. They're always moral arguments. It's just that they don't have a foundation for their morality. That's another story. But yeah, but I think there is something about comedians, though, that, and it's not to say comedians aren't varied in their perspective and their, the different
that was
things.
Me texting you.
Yeah, my wife. I just want to make sure, So
I want to let people know you have a wonderful, lovely wife, Danica. Your daughter Eden is close to John's age. She's between Carol and John, because I remember the birthday party when we were invited. And then
you went to Disneyland, right?
Yes, they were.
Yes,
yeah, we went to Disneyland together.
Disneyland.
I've never been with another comedian and a family at Disneyland, so you guys are the only ones. And then you adopted another child, and 8 years later, you
Kate,
adopted.
We adopted Kate. We got her when she was 14 days old. She was the first safely surrendered baby at I think it was the Victorville Hospital there.
Oh,
so
and then you just adopted another boy 2 weeks ago.
Well, no, we got him when he was 3 months old, and then his adoption was finalized probably about a year later. But he just turned 3, and
they all look like you and Danica. This is amazing
because we did not. We didn't say give us kids that look like us, but they all look like my wife. They're all blonde, and even Rex is blonde. The little 3-year-old, he's blonde. Kate was blonde. Eden's blonde.
Eden is very blonde.
Yeah, well, when she lets her hair go natural.
So what do you think of this whole political correctness now? It's like where the cancel culture.
The cancel culture.
Should I open? Should I start you on this?
Well, yeah, I that's that's the stuff I'm trying to. Well, first, I do think if Biden's president or not, I mean, I do think there was something fishy going on. I'm not saying that the election was so rigged that that's the only reason he's president, but I don't think we can deny that there wasn't discrepancies in the system this year. And that's troubling. And what's troubling are groups that don't want to investigate that, because we're talking about our democracy here. But that's part of the cancel culture. If you look at, the best word for it is cultural Marxism. But if you look at Marxism was not about fixing things. Marxism is not about making what's there better. Marxism is about replacing what is there. Mm-hmm. That's why cultural Marxism is about canceling your history. If you look at Marxist countries, they want to cancel history. They destroy history. That's why, you see all these people tearing down statues because, somebody from the 18th or 19th century doesn't have 21st century sensibilities. And it's not to say it's not to say you ever justify racism, but every person is a product of the time they live in. Woodrow Wilson was a blatant racist. Did he do anything good in office? Again, you can't dismiss and he's a Democrat, so I doubt it. But the point is, you can't dismiss his entire career. It's almost like dismissing someone. It's a caricature. This is why it's like Nazis now, for good reasons, have become a caricature though of who they really are. And it's like, and I think that's damaging because it does create an us and them that's unrealistic. Because if Nazis are just this caricature, bad person, evil person, then of course you're the good, person with the white hat. But humanity is much more complex because it's like the people who say, I believe people are basically noble and good. It's always basically. No one says people are perfectly noble and good, because why? Right. There's too much evidence people are not basically noble and good. They are at heart completely self-centered and selfish. What Christians would say, we're sinful by nature. And to think otherwise is a naive view of humanity, but it's to latch on to all these false narratives. And cultural Marxism is the greatest one today. And I feel like that's really our greatest struggle right now in this country, because the institutions of this country, and this is nothing new, people know this, higher education, I would say public schools. This is why I homeschool, but I'm not saying you can't put your kids in public school. I just say you really got to be an aware, on-hands parent if your kids are in public school. Yeah. But our public institutions, especially, now I'm not as much in high school, but I think it's pushing there, but especially higher education, universities, colleges, they are pushing a particular worldview. It's not about critical thinking. I mean, you always hear people saying, I'm just thinking for myself. No, someone told you to think for yourself. And when they told you that, you know what they were doing? They were telling you how to think. So no one literally thinks for themselves. We're all being influenced by someone. The question is, are the things influencing us true or false? Are they truth or falsehood? So
does it matter?
Yeah, but
No.
in political institutions and everything else, it's like sometimes it's about power, sometimes it's about worldview though. And I think, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, being Middle Eastern, like, you know what, when we voted, there was only one dot, like, so you can't really mess up the vote because it's only one dot and one person, you pick one, they're going to be there.
What you say in the Middle East?
They're going to be there for 30 years or 40 years unless America gets involved, and then we'll have a new one. But let me switch on you. Where do you think the evangelical Christian that were, during the time of Trump? Well, I'm not assuming that Trump going to lose, but what I'm saying, okay, here the evangelical Christians developed this reputation of being, the Republican, the Trump followers, and even, the left started associating them with, and by the way, this is our first political show. We've never talked politics before, but this is, when you have a comedian like Thor who's intellectual, you have to go there. So what do you say? What should the evangelical Christians do now to, if we got a new president or a new,
where should they go? I think, well, number one, you always realize that God is sovereign. So there's nothing to worry about in that sense. We don't panic. But at the same time, saying God is sovereign doesn't mean we're passive. And I think that's the big misconception people have a lot of times when you talk about the sovereignty of God in salvation. Or, if you talk about the sovereignty of God in salvation, people are like, well, why should we even share the gospel? It's the same thing in real life. It's like, well, if God is sovereign, he's sovereign over all things. If he's not God. If he's not sovereign over something, he's not God. That's by definition is what makes him God. He's sovereign. But the good news for us, he's also gentle and humble at heart. That's how Jesus defines himself. If in Matthew 11:28 through 32, it's only one place in all four gospels where Jesus says, this is who I am. And he defines his heart by saying it's gentle. He's gentle and humble. So that's good news to have a sovereign God who's gentle and humble. But the first thing is we don't panic because God's in control, but we don't become passive. And I think this is where Christians have been way too passive. I think we have to be bolder now in a loving way. With the cancel culture, when someone calls you a bigot or a racist, you just kindly say, that's actually false. Just because I'm white doesn't mean I'm a racist. That's a false narrative. I don't buy into it. I'm sorry if you're buying into it, but you have to show me in my speech, in my behavior, and something I've done, prove to me that I'm a racist or a bigot. If you define me, this is the crazy thing. I grew up in the 1960s, right? Martin Luther King. When I was a kid, when I was about 7, 8, 9 years old, all these things were happening. Bobby Kennedy was shot. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. And these things were, the Vietnam War was going on, and these things were just on the news. I mean, they didn't put up any trigger warnings. Make sure your kids aren't in the room because you're about to see a Vietnamese man shot in the head and bleed on the street. Boom, there it is on the news. You're a kid, you're watching it because there were only 3 channels back then. So this is what you watched. But Martin Luther King Jr. said, we shouldn't judge each other on the basis of the color of our skin. And if you do, you're a racist or you're a bigot. And now what's being done? We're defining ourselves by the color of our skin. That's identity politics. And it is
very deep,
unchristian, it is unloving, and it's unbiblical. So as Christians, we have to speak truth to power, and truth to power in terms of the cultural narrative that dominates is the powerful one. So we have to kindly speak into that and say, you know what, I'm not a bigot. I'm not this, or I'm not that, however you want to define me. So number one, speak into things that you weren't afraid to speak into. And I think just do it in a loving way. And the whole idea is truth wins out in the end, but we cannot be afraid to speak up and to say, it's like, I voted for Trump this last year. This is the only time in my entire political life as a human being that I actually voted for someone. In the past, I always voted against a party. The Democrats were always a little too left, but I grew up in a Democratic home, right? My dad was always like, he was a trucker. So he's like, the Democrats are for the working man. We're Democrats. And oddly enough, now all the Democrats are really rich and powerful people in Hollywood. It's like, where did that switch happen? Clearly, they're not for the working man anymore. That's why I'm so amazed. So many working class people are duped, and so many minorities, I feel, are duped by the Democratic Party. 2 amazing documentaries people have to watch. First one is What Killed Michael Brown. It's a must-see. What Killed Michael Brown. It's by a Black intellectual by the name of Shelby Steele. It is absolutely amazing. I don't know how someone can watch that and deny the narrative that he presents in that documentary. And
Netflix?
that was, what's that?
Is it on Netflix?
It is on Prime Video. I canceled Netflix. Speaking of cancel culture, I canceled Netflix.
Okay.
I canceled Netflix because of the whole Cuties. I think it was Cuties.
Oh yeah, the French movie. Yeah, that's horrible.
Yeah, so I'm like, I'm done with you guys. That was it. I mean, it's like there's a point too. I mean, I normally don't believe in boycotting. I don't believe boycotting works, but I believe it works when huge numbers do it. And I think it can be proven that Netflix felt a financial hit with people canceling Netflix because of that particular movie. So now we'll see what happens with them. They're supposed to be making the Chronicles of Narnia. So if that's the case, maybe I'll come back and watch them. But Right now,
it makes you feel good to respect yourself that, hey, I don't believe in this. I'm going to do something about it. This is something you learn from Americans. Like, if I don't like something, I'm going to say something about it. I'm going to do something about it. And you're right. This whole thing, as us being Christians, are like, sometimes we're very passive. We just don't want to,
well,
have you read the Miles McPherson book, The Third Place, which is a very interesting book
I
about,
haven't.
it's like when Joshua was fighting against Jericho, and the angel came up and he asked the angel, "Are you with us or are you against us?" He said, "I'm neither with you nor with them. I'm with the Lord." And that's where he in his book said the third place, which is where we as
Yeah.
Christians we need to stand. But you're right. You can't be passive. You gotta be
Yeah,
loving.
well,
But
and some of it lends itself because we're gentle. It's the whole idea. Jesus was gentle and humble of heart.
mm,
He's gentle with those who want to crucify. He's gentle with everybody. Whether you're on his side or against him, he's generally gentle. Now, but at the same time, he spoke the truth, and so I feel like we can speak the truth, and I feel like we, as Christians, generally we don't, even though we're Protestants, right? Our name comes from protest. We come from a line of people who protested falsehood regarding the gospel. So thank God for the Reformation, that because they protested the teaching of the false gospel at that time, that we have the gospel now restored, the gospel that was biblical. So our whole background is Protestants. We're protesters. And I think we've gotten away from that because as conservatives don't generally protest. That's really a radical leftist thing. But I think we need to get better. That's why I called my show The Protest Show. Because I'm like, yeah, Biden might be your president. He's not my president. I mean, right now, I don't even know if he's a legitimate president, to be honest. But, I'm not going to deny that he's president. But what I will do is protest his policies, protest his way of thinking, really protesting a false worldview. And I feel like we have to do that. And I'm going to do it through comedy, but do it in some way,
right.
Because I feel like a lot, like my wife's been a supporter from 2016. She was a supporter. So I kind of finally came around, but she's watching people I'd never even heard of. And she's watching these people. And I noticed that a lot of the people like have all these podcasts and different programs and stuff, but none of them were really intentionally funny. Like they might be humorous, but but I'm going, I'm writing it, I'm reciting it, I'm making it look like a Daily Show type of broadcast, even though it's 5 minutes, but still I'm trying to make it funny other than not having a live audience. So we'll see how funny it is, but funny to me. It's a funny to me show.
You're also not just a comedian or a pastor. You're an author. You wrote a book, many books, and I love the titles. But the first one I want to mention here is called the Money Meltdown. Because your name is Thor Ramsey, not Dave Ramsey. Thor Ramsey's Total Money Meltdown: A Proven Plan for Financial Disaster.
Well, there's a whole long story behind that book that I really don't have time to tell, but is there a story behind that book? But my wife and I basically followed Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover to get out of debt. And what I started doing was kind of keeping a journal. Because man, when you're trying to get out of debt, it is hard. It's discouraging. And I started keeping a journal going because I was talking to my editor at the time. Somebody that was, I'd write this stuff and send it to him, and he'd give me comments on stuff, and I'd rewrite and send it back. But he was like, "What's your next project going to be?" And I'm like, "I don't know." But I started keeping a journal. I could probably make a book out of this, climbing out of debt. And we kind of figured that this book would kind of be a supplemental, is what was the idea, to Dave Ramsey's book, because as you're working his plan, you really need encouragement on those days you feel like quitting. And so I just shared every stupid financial thing we did as an encouragement to people. It was like, no, yeah, there's someone dumber than you out there financially. So it took us about 18 months to climb out of debt. So the book had a happy ending.
Oh, it had. You did climb out.
Yeah,
I remember you used to say something like the only way we can get out of debt is one of us dies. Me telling your wife.
I forgot about that joke. Yeah. So
and then you came up with a book called Broke: How Not to Give Up When Climbing Out of Debt.
That's actually a rewrite. That's basically the same book.
Oh.
Because we ran it. It's a long story, but we ran into some copyright issues when they made that cover.
With Dave Ramsey?
Yeah. Oh, boy.
Yeah. Oh, they'll come after you.
Yeah, he's got his own zip code. So Moody Press does not. So, enough said there. But I've actually started moving towards, I've been working on novels. So, yeah, so I...
fiction, right?
Yeah, fiction. And I've really found that is because what I ended up doing, I was working with an editor who encouraged me to write. He goes, if you're doing a subject like I was working on a book on atheists, and he encouraged me to go out and experience things. So I went to I had a friend who was, he called himself an agnostic Christian. What he was is very confused, but he took me to basically an atheist meeting. They like the Inland Empire and the Inland Empire
gathering.
Free Thinkers Club or whatever they called. And we went to that. And then afterwards, a few of us went to the restaurant next door and had a meal and discussed things. And so that was a great experience. I went and saw Penn and Teller, who are both atheists, in Las Vegas, and attempted to interview them after the show and had a little bit of an interview with them after the show, but just experiences like that. So I was working on that book, and long story short, there was a guy from Cruciform Press that was he's a published fiction author, and he was basically starting a fiction program for them, or a fiction division of their publishing house for them. And he'd read my book, The Most Encouraging Book on Hell.
Yeah, I was going to go into that. The most encouraging book on hell ever.
Yeah. So he'd read that book, and he said, he wrote me a nice note saying that he'd quoted me from that book in his book, which was actually a fiction book. And he sent me his book and the nice note. And I called him up, says, man, I've been working on these novels I have 2 novels I've been working on for literally 20 years.
Wow.
And just, cause I wasn't doing it full time, but I was working on them at certain points. And he said, well, Cruciform really and these were full length novels. Like these are 300 and 400 page novels. And he was saying Cruciform really, really does short form, books. And so I'm like, well, let me get back to you in a couple of weeks here. So I took a book I was writing on atheists and turned it into a novel, because it was all about my experiences and stuff. And I had a story that I'd put aside first, because this is what you do as a writer. Whatever idea you have, you file it away, because you never know when you can use it later. So I had an idea for a screenplay about an atheist. This was even before God's Not Dead came out. And of course, I liked my story idea better, but that's how it always is. You like
I remember that. And
so I had this idea about an atheist, but I took that story idea and then put it in the novel, and then worked everything else around that. And so that's it. They're, supposedly going to publish that. We're waiting for that to be published, but it's at the publisher. It's been edited, been ready to go. And then I have 2 other books I just sent out to a friend of mine, is a journalist for, I think it's called ProPublica is what they're called, but it's like it's a big time secular journalism, online journalism. I don't know if you call it a paper, magazine, whatever it is, but he's been working for them for years, and he lives in New York City. So he's really connected to people, and he just had a book published. I think it's coming out in June, I think, a nonfiction book on the health industry, because that's what he primarily focuses on, his reporting. But he's like, let me send it over to my editor over there at, Penguin Random House, and we'll see. Oh, she likes it. So anyway, so it's a start. We'll see. It's probably going to be too religious for him, but anyway, so that's really my passion right now, is the novels. That's where I feel like I can write, because I made the main character, the narrator's a comedian, because that's my background. So I made him a comedian, and so I basically can insert funny stuff in there with actually trying to say something. And so that actually becomes a much more rewarding way of combining kind of, preaching and comedy. Because in my preaching, I don't try to be funny, to be honest, in my preaching.
You don't
just because,
but it comes out, right? They laugh, right?
If it comes out, it's just natural in the moment, because like sometimes pastors are asking, like, how can I be more funny? And I'm like, well, you're not going to, my view of preaching is you're not going to hold people's interest if you're trying to be funny. Like the worst thing to experience is someone who's trying to be funny. It's generally not. So it's like, if that's not who you are, don't try that. I mean, you're talking about a man who rose from the dead. If you can't make that interesting, quit. That's pretty much it. Because you're talking about the most interesting things in the world, the deepest truths of human reality. you can make those interesting if you don't try to be shallow. The problem is trying to be shallow. You just got to say what it is and not worry about, who's going to be offended by this, who's not going to be offended by this. It just gets too overpowering to, overwhelming to worry about everyone you're going to offend, So.
This is funny because I think after tomorrow, I've been doing a webinar for pastors, and I've offered it for free for them and their staff. It's called How to Add Humor. Say it funny, how to add humor into your sermon.
Right.
But there are certain dynamics, like in 2 weeks.
Some pastors are funny. They just need they need the structure of funny.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what I talk about, and how to think funny and how to find out what makes people laugh and all that. But you know what? Also, you're an actor and you have a movie that you did a few years ago and it's coming out now. Tell me about it.
So I love this story. Oh man, a decade ago, I wrote a screenplay called Youth Group. And I was like, I just want to get this made. I just was looking for somebody who had an eye for filmmaking, thinking I would just basically, literally, let's just get a bunch of people and make this movie. Let's just do it that way. So I came across this guy on the web, Christopher Sean Shaw.
I know him.
We were Facebook friends somehow, but he put up these really, they're silly little videos of his goldfish. He made a series of he made a series out of his goldfish. So I thought that was funny in itself. So I basically, contacted him through Facebook, and he said, "Hey, we're just starting the 168 Film Festival this week. You want to join the team?" I'm like, "I'm looking to
remember
filmmakers. Sure, let's jump in." So I jumped into that, and I was really just on board to help write it and everything like that. But as we brainstormed and everything, and I came up with this idea, and then they were like, "Well, why don't you play the character?" So I'm like, "Okay." So we did this short film called Skip Listening, which I think people can find online if they search for Skip Listening, Skip SKIP Listening, short film Skip Listening. They should be able to find it online somewhere and watch this 10-minute film. So we did that, and we actually, got tons of, we placed second behind the best picture that year at the 168 Film Festival. And for a comedy to do that, it was a comedy. And so Christopher and I started this long-term relationship in terms of filmmaking, and we've probably made, I don't know how, we've made a bunch of short 10-minute films. But so I told him, it's like, "Hey, I've got this screenplay. Why don't we do this?" Because I'm trying to think of their names now. Corey, you probably know him. He's
Corey Edwards.
Corey Edwards, yeah, Corey Edwards, yes. And his brother, Todd. Is it Todd? I don't remember his brother's name. I think it's Todd. But Corey and Todd Edwards had made an independent film years ago called Chillicothe. And yeah, we all agreed it was a bad name. But the point is, it got into Sundance, and Corey was sharing with me how they, because I did a gig with Corey one night at a church in, I think the Bayside Church in the Bay Area, but Bayside Church up in Sacramento, I think it is. But,
Sacramento, yeah, Bayside.
Yeah, Corey and I did a gig there one night, and so on the ride over, we were talking, and he was sharing with me how they got that movie funded, and so I'm like, that's brilliant. So basically, I told Christopher, because what they did is they made a trailer for a film that didn't exist yet, so they just shot the trailer, and then they had a big apparently they were connected to big rich people. So they had a trailer, doctors and lawyers, and then showed them the trailer and raised half the money to make the film that night, basically. So Christopher and I didn't know that many doctors and lawyers. So what we basically did is, but we knew enough filmmakers. So we had people just commit for the day, and we shot a 2-minute trailer. So we just shot, basically, we picked different segments through, is oddly enough, we used the same church that we ended up shooting the movie at. So, but it was interesting how that church became available, and it was a big, gigantic mega church out in the Los Angeles area. And so we shot the trailer there, and then just started showing the trailer. And Christopher he was doing social media stuff that would embarrass me. I'm like, please, just calm down, because it's like, this is stuff I would be embarrassed by. But thank God there's people like that just don't have a sense of embarrassment. because Stephen Baldwin saw the trailer and called us and said, man, I love this. Let's get together and meet. So we actually had a meeting with Stephen. The meeting in itself, well, I'll tell you, so Christopher, first we have a phone meeting. We talk through, this is probably, I don't know, 45 minutes to an hour phone meeting. So we're going to meet him in LA then. So we meet Stephen Stephen Baldwin at this secret type of Hollywood actor hotel that's in almost like a residential area, so people don't recognize it and type of thing. But we meet him on the roof, of course, you know, go to the highest level. So we meet him on the roof of this hotel, and he'd just come from a meeting with Mel Gibson about some Viking movie Mel Gibson was trying to make. And then that night, and I didn't know this, I'm not, I don't have People magazine. I don't know all the ins and outs of these relationships. But as we're in the meeting, his daughter comes up with a group of kids from, they're in the series. Miley Cyrus had a series at the time. I forget what it was called.
Yes.
Hannah Montana.
Hannah Montana. Yes, of course. My kids. There was
some cast members from Hannah Montana.
Yeah.
And they came up and they were on their way over to Will Smith's son's house, to hang out with his son. Jaden. But it was just one of those nights where you just felt like it was surreal because, you know, this is not your everyday life. And it almost felt like what it felt like is that you're walking down the street and you see a man on a unicycle with a cow on his head juggling, and this is just bizarre. And but that's what that first meeting was like. But that's what got the ball rolling. And then Stephen went out and found the guy from My Pillow, Mike Lindell,
yes,
who also funded Unplanned, the movie, and he basically funded our movie that was originally titled Youth Group, but it is now it's being retitled, but it's supposed to come out in March this year, but it's themed around Good Friday. And so it's about a big, gigantic mega church on Good Friday. And so I'm excited again that it's actually going to come out. Are you
still acting in it, right? You're still the main.
I ended up, I played the lead character in it. And that's probably why it took 4 years to get released. Because generally in movie making, here's how it goes. You get the money and then you go try to get a distribution deal. And then the distribution people tell you, okay, before you make this, here's who needs to be in it, because this is how we can sell it.
Right.
And if they go, we want to put Thor Ramsey as the lead. They're going like, who is he? We've never heard of him. No one knows. He's not a draw. No. You know, Kirk Cameron, we know. Thor Ramsey, we don't. Kevin Sorbo, we know. Thor Ramsey, so it's like, no.
Right.
And so it took us 4 years to finally get it released, but it should be out in March at some point. I don't have all the details yet, but right now it looks like March. So that's exciting.
When do you have time for Danica, your wife?
It sounds much more busier than it is, but look, you can see, I'm in my garage. So since the pandemic, I moved into the garage. So there's a green screen right over there. That's church. Everything.
Are you still doing church online, right?
We are, because we're a church plant. We were meeting in a school, so we lost our facility.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so we're talking to another church now that, matter of fact, I was going to email him today, but we're talking to another church. They meet at 9 or 9:30, so they're talking about letting us use their facility for free at 11. So if that comes out, then we'll be live again, which would be very exciting. And then, so the last thing I'll tell you about is, so Leland, Bone, Darren and I have been meeting for about the last 3 or 4 months. We meet every Tuesday, and we've been working out a storyline for a screenplay because we always thought, we always talked about doing something together just as friends. And so we're coming up with these storylines and working out these stories about 4 friends and what goes on with them. So that's been fun, just reconnecting with those guys and seeing them every week now, because right before the pandemic, my goal was to call call friends that I've known for years once a week and just to check up. And I called them all first at the beginning of the year going, hey, I just want to start, just so you guys know. So, because a lot of times when you don't talk to people every week, when you see a call, you're like, oh, this is going to be a long conversation. But I just wanted to let them know it might be a 5-10 minute. I just want to connect with you every week. And but once the pandemic hit, I actually was more busy because now I had to become a production company to make church happen. It's that whole thing. We all became televangelists at that point. And so I was more busy once the pandemic hit than I was before the pandemic. I had more free time.
So how much time you spend with your wife?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I'm in the garage right now. All I got to just walk inside and boom, we're spending time together.
Boom, you're home. So what is like having a new baby, a 2-year-old right now with all this?
Well, he's a boy and we have 2 girls. So yeah, there's 8 years in between all our kids. Yeah, though, because we're good planners. But
maybe because you thought they're not gonna finish college in 4 years. Is that why?
Well, we didn't. So with Rex, Rex was almost like the accidental pregnancy in one sense, even though he's adopted. So what happened was we were talking about this is right before, if people don't know this, then the foster care system in the state changed. Because before you could go through the county to get a baby, and now they were making everyone go through agencies. Because we'd just gone through this to the foster care system with Kate, and that was a great experience, great story there. We don't have time for today, but so they called us and said, "Do you guys want to renew your license? Because if you renew it, you can still go for the county, but if you don't, then if you renew it again, you'll have to go through an agency." So we said, "Well, let's just renew it." We were talking about maybe we'll look to get a child in between Kate and Eden. So, someone in between their ages. I think she was it was between 18 and, about 10 at the time. Yeah. So somebody maybe 14 like that. And so we renewed our license, and somebody from church said, "Look, in our churches, we're big advocates of orphan care, foster care, and orphan care. And we've just made that part of the values that we have as a church. It's a biblical value, but again, every church can't do everything. So we really emphasize that. And we've had a couple other couples then who have fostered, and another couple looking to foster to adopt. So it becomes, once somebody's doing it and it becomes part of a church culture. And I saw this happen in Redlands at that church. We were a small church of like 60 or 70 people. And literally we had about 20 kids in the congregation that were from foster homes or being adopted. So we had a huge group of people that just jumped on board and really made a difference in their lives, in some kid's life. And so we had somebody from church say, I know you guys are passionate about this. I have somebody at school who has an aunt who has their niece's baby, and she can't take care of it right now because of her arm, and she's having surgery. So he was 3 months old, and we took him in thinking it was temporary. Because we were doing, meetings with his mom, and she was working the program and everything. And we really liked the mom, actually. It wasn't that we didn't like her, of course, but she was a heroin addict, but you would have never known that meeting her. I mean, I don't know it's kind of like what false images we have sometimes, but you meet her, it's like her teeth weren't missing. She was, she didn't look like she lived on the street type of thing, but she's following the program. Long story short, heroin is really hard to get off of. Yes. Most heroin addicts relapse about 18 times, but we thought she was doing well, and then she just fell off the face of the earth. And long story short, we ended up, keeping him because we had him. So we thought it was just short term, and that's not really our MO. We generally foster to adopt. So it's hard to take a kid because it's a different mentality. When you have a kid, you only know you're going to have him short term, but we never really thought of him that way. We always just loved him as if he were our own, thinking one day we might have to give him back to the mother, but we're doing our part in his life right now. But it's just been a great blessing, though he's a boy, so it's really different because he is on 24/7. He never stops. So if you're watching him, you can't turn your head because he's going to break something or eat something or wrestle something or tie something or tie himself. Something's going to happen. So, man.
You know what? I really appreciate your time. It's almost been an hour. We have a few minutes. How can you encourage people who are listening in a time where there's a pandemic, there might be a change in government, they might be a shutdown, they might be as a pastor now?
Well, this is what encouraged me, has been encouraging me. So I generally just preach sermons that I wish I would have heard when I was a Christian. That's generally
That's
how
a
I handle
great
ministry.
idea. That's a great
I
idea.
wish somebody would have told me this. But there's a great book, and if people are readers, I would highly encourage them to get this book. And even if they're not readers, because it's an easy read, it's not written at a highfalutin theological level. It's just a great down-to-earth book called Gentle and Lowly. It's by Dane Ortland, Gentle and Lowly. And the entire book is really unpacking Jesus in Matthew 11 that I quoted before, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." For I'm gentle and humble at heart. And it's really unpacking this idea that Jesus's heart towards you is love. It's gentle and lowly. Because I think a lot of us, and I know I've struggled with this my entire Christian life, have this sense that God is secretly displeased with us because we failed yet again. So he's clearly, even though he loves us, he's a little disappointed in us. And this book will completely dispel that. And I think in these times of the pandemic, cabin fever is a true thing. Stir crazy is a true thing. There's symptoms, and one of them is mild depression. There's other symptoms. If you're feeling irritable and impatient, that's another symptom. But this book will really help you combat some of those things, because it is really shining the biblical view of God's heart towards you on your mind and heart, so that it changes how you feel about how you think God feels about you. So I would encourage them, grab that book by Dane Ortland, Gentle and Lowly.
Wonderful. When you mentioned two movies on Prime, you only mentioned What Killed Michael Brown. What was the other movie?
Oh, the other is called Uncle Tom.
Uncle Tom. Oh yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, really good.
Yes. Wonderful. Well, all right. So your movie is going to come out in March.
Yep.
And how can people get a hold of you?
You can go to thorramsey.com.
THORRAMSEY.com.
Or if you go to centerchurch.life, that's our church website. So CENTER church.life. That's our church website, but there's contact information either, you can email me from either of those locations, I believe. If you, I have to check, I haven't checked my website in so long, but I'm about to change it.
It's under construction.
Yeah.
By the way,
I'm about to change it, but if you can't email me directly from my, because it might be the agent that you go to, but if you can't, but he'll forward it either way. Tim always forwards things. So,
right.
But either way, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Send my love to Danica and the Cares. I think we need to get together soon.
Yeah, man. Great talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you. God bless you. Thank you so much, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Alrighty. And guys, if you are watching, remember every weeknight at 8:30 p.m. on Facebook under Comedian Nazareth, you get to enjoy an hour where you can become the comedian and you get encouraged, because we'll ask you for prayer requests and we'll encourage you at the end of it. So love you guys and have a great week. I'll see you tonight if you join us. God bless.